All right. Thank you so much, Malika. Love your energy for Friday. Got me thinking about the
Well, I
fish
think
fry
I'm about
already.
fashion, so
Great. So we are going to move into our panel discussion. So we'll ask Stephen Hall to come back. We also have Chris Bandura and Francisco Arriaga, I believe, are going to join us as part of this panel discussion. So we would encourage participants, if you have questions for our panelists, to put those questions in the chat box. We will monitor it there. And as we go through the next half hour, we have about 27 minutes, I guess, according to my clock here, that before we take a break. So one question I have in general, and I'm not sure who it's more guided towards, but in terms of the climate change influence, so maybe Stephen, if you want to take a crack at this, I guess first, the climate change influence, that decision to install irrigation, how often is that going to pay back? We see in dry years, there's always this big influx of investment in irrigation. And as we go forward with this variability in, wet years, dry years, is the payback there for irrigation, or how would you look at uh, uh, going through that decision-making process, I guess.
yeah,
And
that's
so I'll leave that open for everybody to answer.
absolutely. That's a great question, Jerry. I think you'd have to run the numbers for your particular operation, and just, estimate, well, what kind of a yield gain do we expect to benefit? But the one point I will make is that I think we've underestimated the benefits of irrigation, even in sort of humid climates. And so there was that study that I briefly highlighted where folks from across the Midwest looked at the yield benefits of drainage water recycling, in these humid, nice fine textured soils, right? And they found that just adding a little bit of water back during those reproductive stages of corn and soybeans could have a large yield benefit. And so whether or not that would pencil out for your particular operation, I think you'd want to run the numbers, right? What are your upfront costs and what are your expected yield benefits year over year? Of course, then we have to estimate the grain prices, which Jeff Hadachek will give us some insight on that this afternoon. But yeah, you want to think carefully about it. But again, for some growers that we've talked to that have a little bit of money to think about investing, they thought that it was worth considering.
Any other panelists want to take a shot at that one? Oh, let me back up. I shouldn't have jumped into this so soon. We got Chris and Francisco.
Yeah.
Chris, let's introduce yourselves. I'm jumping ahead here way too fast.
All right.
So, yeah,
Thanks.
sorry,
Thanks,
apologize
Jerry.
for that.
Morning, everybody. My name is Chris Bandura, one of the statewide conservation cropping outreach specialists. I sit in Wausau, Wisconsin, but get to go and play everywhere in the state. Key focuses are all things soil health, soil function, and mainly doing some on-farm research, looking at legume cover crop species and trying to quantify nitrogen credits to corn, both the magnitude of those credits and also the variability of those credits within a given field. So that's me.
Francisco?
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Francisco Arriaga. I'm a professor in the Department of Soil and Environmental Sciences here at UW-Madison. I'm also a state specialist. I work in the area of soil and water management and conservation. So doing a lot of work looking at soil health, surface water quality, a little bit of leaching, tillage. And so with tillage and those kind of things and soil health, looking at productivity issues as well.
All right, thank you. Apologize for jumping ahead on that. Should have had you introduce yourselves earlier. Um, so I guess Chris, your work with cover crops, that's one that definitely has interest across the state and throughout the Midwest. Uh, Regarding rye, or some of winter rye is pretty popular, and I guess from a financial standpoint, or maybe the impact on soil health, maybe some of the drainage types of benefits, or attraction of water, those kind of things. Is Are there other cover crops that might be more uh, economically impactful versus rye just being cheap? And is there other things that farmers could be thinking about?
Yeah, good question, Jerry. Thanks for that. I think to start off with, I don't think anyone in Extension has said it yet today, so I'll say it depends. We'll start with that. It depends on what your goal is, what your goals are. I think, I mean, just 30,000 foot view, thinking about cover cropping. Cereal rye is cheap. Cereal rye can provide several benefits to both, short-term soil health, thinking about some of the physical characteristics, right, where we want to increase infiltration quickly. We know that rye can help us with that, aggregation, building structure, things like that, and those short-term things. In long term, right, so continuing to enhance structure and infiltration, maybe some carbon inputs and nutrient cycling, things like that. But when we think about some other species, so like I had mentioned a little bit ago, thinking about legume species, the one thing they can do is help provide some nitrogen through, some of those relationships they form with the below ground bugs, if you will, fixing nitrogen out of the atmosphere. And then next year, as that biomass decomposes, that nitrogen releases out of that biomass relatively quickly compared to something like a cereal rye. If rye scavenges, residual nitrates from the soil, that's going to decompose, and eventually that nitrogen might come back, but at a much slower rate than something from like a legume cover crop biomass. So I think in terms of economics and getting something out of it, it just depends on what your goal is, what we're trying to accomplish. And really that drives what you decide to do. From a winter hardiness though, many folks around the state, fall is cold, fall is wet, especially in the northern half to third of the state. Um, Rye is quite successful even up here. Other species are a little bit more touch and go. So depending on what, phase in your crop rotation you're looking at putting covers in, if it's after something like winter wheat or oat harvest where you have a lot of summer left, there's a ton of opportunities for more than just rye to establish and perform all the functions that we want. The later in the season we get, the more limited we are, where cereal rye becomes the default go-to.
Yeah. Francisco, comment?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Chris said. Beginning with the sort of the end in mind. What is your objective? What's your goal? But I wanted to mention one of the reasons why you see a lot of work with winter rye. It's not unique to Wisconsin. Even in my days back in the southeast a while back, that was the main cover crop because it's easy to establish. Like you mentioned, Jerry, the seed is relatively cheap, survives the winter, produces a lot of biomass pretty quick too, and so it provides a lot of benefits to the soil in that. Is it perfect? No. There's drawbacks with it in that it can suppress corn yields. It's difficult to terminate a lot of times. But I think one of the reasons we see so much of that of the winter rights because of that, it establishes easily and it grows pretty fast.
Great. Thank you. All right, we did receive a couple questions here in the chat. So, how close are we to regulations being put in place to the amount of nitrogen we can place on crops in the central sands? So this is kind of a crystal ball type of question, but
can you repeat the question again? Can you repeat it, Jerry?
Sure. How close are we to regulations being put in place to the amount of nitrogen we can apply in the central sands? Maybe from a water quality standpoint too there. So I'll leave that open for who wants to take a crack at it first.
I guess,
Yeah, go ahead, Francis.
I'll just say quickly, probably far away. There's a lot of issues, a lot of things going on, and a lot of things to consider. Obviously, a lot of politics involved, and I think that we're a long ways from that.
I'll maybe skirt that a little bit, Jerry. I think Francisco, that's a great answer on that. Let's dance around that though. Maybe the brighter side of that question might be what are folks currently working on and trying to do in the central sands to combat, just the permeability of those soils and the fate of nitrogen in those soils, so there are a lot of very innovative farmers, agronomists, researchers looking at ways to enhance the efficiency of the nitrogen that we use out there, be that more frequent fertigation events where we're spoon feeding that crop with nitrogen, trying to spread that out, right? Looking at things like cover cropping, looking at things like interseeding, so growing something in between potato rows, for example, doing things after that vine kill period during the potato phase of that rotation to try to soak up nitrogen. Steven's got some very interesting liquid cover crop work going on. So there's just all sorts of innovation happening in that part of the state to help us with that problem. And farmers want to do the right thing, right? That's one thing. Like we farmers, everyone wants to do things as best as we can. And I think if we continue putting effort and science towards that, we're going to get a long ways with it.
Yeah, I'll answer that question as honestly as I know how, which is in my experience, Wisconsin has been a state of carrots, not a state of sticks when it comes to this stuff. So all of our focus is on like the most delicious, most attractive carrots that we can come up with. And to echo what Chris said, the growers in that part of the state are like thinking of cool carrots, right? And we are working with them to think of the best carrots that we can think of. The other part about this is I came from California, right? So I came from a state where there was a stick, and the stick was easier to implement in Western states on nitrates because there's not rain happening during the growing season. So logistically, we have to figure out how that stick would even work when we have rain that's coming through in the growing season. In California, they just had a nitrogen management plan. They had to account for the amount of nitrate that was in the groundwater and apply it towards an irrigation credit. We could potentially do that here, but we have to be able to do real-time management, co-management of both irrigation and nitrogen. And I'm not saying that wouldn't happen. We're working on sensors to be able to do that and to be able to directly monitor the amount of nitrate that's in the groundwater that's being applied as fertigation through the irrigation. But it's much more complicated scientifically to do it here because we get rain during our growing season.
And I'll finally just jump in and say that Jed Cahoon is actually spearheading an effort involving a number of UW and extension folks that are trying to address this from a comprehensive perspective, right? It's not going to be a silver bullet that solves this. It's going to be a lot of little hammers. And so, hopefully in a couple of years, we'll be able to, we're working with growers and come up with some comprehensive solutions that are actually implementable. And I think as long as, that dream stays alive, I think, we can make some progress.
Yeah, great. I got a couple more in the chat box. NRCS extended the cover crop planting deadline for cost sharing programs to October 31st this year. Rye planted at the end of October in central Wisconsin is now only 2 to 3 inches tall. Is there much of a benefit to soil health from late planted rye? Chris, you want to maybe take a first crack at that? Or?
I can start with that. Yeah, so obviously the earlier the planting, the more biomass we get in the fall, and that's better, right? That more roots, more above ground biomass, the more soil protection we have there. However, some roots are better than no roots. Some above ground biomass is better than no above ground biomass. And then thinking ahead, to spring, same concept. The more is better, right? But sometimes that's not the luxury we have up in this climate. So I personally say yes, there is still benefit to doing it, even if we don't get the biomass that we might get, say, planted a couple of weeks or a month earlier, or being in the southern part of the state where there's a few more GDUs left to be had. And also, I take a little side spin on that as well before we pass it off. thinking about management, like if you're an early adopter to the practice, maybe small rye is easier to deal with in your first year or two. So although it could be it's a drawback, reduced biomass production is a drawback because we want more to get more out of it. Perhaps it's easier to manage next spring, thinking about terminating or planting into it green, what have you. Um, maybe there's a carrot there with that reality that we might face with late planted rye.
Um, Next question then, is there any new UW or extension research on nitrogen fixating crops beyond the crimson clover and common berseem clovers? There are new forages that yield more, are more cold tolerant, and higher yielding. So,
I know we've got some folks internally doing some research on winter camelina, looking at how that's doing around the state, both from just survivability, production, nitrogen credits, things like that. Stephen or Malika, do you want to speak to any of those? Maybe they're not true legumes, but some of the other things that are being researched at Hancock, like the corn and fixing corn work that's being done out there.
So our colleague John Michel Ané has been working on these corn hybrids with a trait of these aerial roots that produce a mucilage where nitrogen fixing bacteria can thrive. And so essentially introducing that trait to hybrids that will be productive in the Midwest. And so that's hopefully going to be hit prime time within the next couple of years. And I know Marta Coman, who's coming later, I think she's working on some nitrogen fixation work in alfalfa. So maybe she can speak to that.
Yeah, my plan was to pass this to Marta. So I'm glad you mentioned her. I think that she'd be great to ask about this too.
okay. And then another question is on the depth of some recommendations, pros and cons on the depth of tile drainage tile. What are some recommended pros, cons type of things for drainage?
Yeah, I think a standard would be 4 feet, right? That's kind of around the standard. But Stephen has been talking a little bit about some of the benefits of shallow tile for certain locations. Stephen, do you want to share some of that?
Yeah, there's some evidence from around the Midwest that shallower depth and narrower spacing can be advantageous, right? And maybe helps us deal with this trade-off of wet and dry conditions better. There was some discussion up north in Eau Claire. Well, can we really go that shallow in the frigid north, right? And I think that remains to be seen and is sort of an interesting frontier. So if folks are doing that, that'd be interested to know, how it's going and if they've had success with shallower installations in more northerly areas.
But I will say there are a lot of just design considerations here too to consider, like what is your soil texture like? What is the layering of your soil like, right? Like what are some of these specifics that what was the term that we always say in extension? It depends. But I did want to just plug that we will be doing an intro tile drainage workshop on February 20th, where we're going to talk a little bit in more depth on these tile considerations. So stay in touch with extension and we'll be sharing information about that workshop too, because then we'll get into the engineering and physics of it, which is non-trivial.
So Malika, in that regards, is there and maybe Francisco, you could chime in on this too. The depth, does that what you're doing on the surface, no-till, tillage, cover crops, is there an interaction to that? Obviously, I would think the amount of water that would happen to flow through if it's shallower or deeper, or depending on what you're doing for management on that top foot of surface.
I'll take a first crack at it, I guess. So the tile you want to think about, when you have an internal drainage issue. So there's some restrictive layer that it's impeding water drainage deeper in the profile, and so that's one of the considerations when installing the tile. The depth and all that is looking at the restrictive layer. But absolutely, whatever you do on the surface, as far as like you mentioned, no-till affects what could be coming out of the tile. And one thing to think about is, for example, if you have tile drain and you're going to apply manure, one of the recommendations that Yield Extension currently has, this is from work that Discovery Farms conducted a while back, is to do some shallow tillage to break up the direct conduits to the tile itself. So that should reduce any losses of nitrate, phosphorus, and even E. coli if it's dealing with manure through the tile itself. Mallika?
Yes, I was just going to say these practices can definitely be helpful, potentially in the export of nitrogen and phosphorus through those tiles, because what we're essentially doing when we're installing tile drainage is taking non-point source pollution and making it point source pollution. So we're very interested in managing as best as we can with new tile installations, trying to limit as much of the leaching as we can. So that's another place where active area of research and those soil management practices could be helpful.
All right, thank you. Got a couple more questions here. Is there a tool or model that can help farmers determine the optimal time to terminate cover crops in the spring?
So I've been talking to a few folks to do such a tool. We don't have, I don't think, currently one. So we're kind of in the first stages of kind of brainstorming that and getting people interested in this type of tool to help develop it. And it would be considering things such as, not this past season, but the season before, for example, we had a lack of moisture. So, if that's coming, kind of providing those type of terminations, but also considering the goals, like Chris was talking about, what's your goal? So if it's weed management, there's work that Rodrigo World has conducted on that. And so try to incorporate some of this information into a tool that help people kind of make those decisions.
So that'll take into play growing degree days and those kind of things, you think, Francisco?
Correct.
All of
Yeah.
that? Okay.
Correct. And the
Great.
planting, when was it planted,
Sure.
when was it seeded, those type of things. Yeah.
Great. Look forward to that. Another question. After the dry summer of 2023, several growers had issues with alfalfa plugging tiles and causing tile blowouts. Is this common or an issue with cover crops on tiled fields?
So is the question that cover crops causing tile blowouts? Did I understand correctly?
Yeah, I think is alfalfa plugging it common, and then is there an
Oh.
issue with cover crops also plugging it on tiled fields? So
This is where something where I know we do not have data on this from Wisconsin, but Stephen, I'm curious, have you heard anything about this from Iowa?
In terms of rye, no, there's typically not enough deep root biomass to cause any damage. Alfalfa, yeah, it can go deep, right? And so I think we had a, unique opportunity last year that would really, stimulate that deep root growth as that crop was trying to get water wherever it could. So, as increasingly we'll want to keep an eye on see if this is a problem too. I think it would also be interesting to see, well, where is this happening, right? Is this happening in fields with old clay tile, versus modern tile? I suspect, the latter, like the old, that this is sort of a consequence of legacy systems, and that might be an indication that it's time to think about modernizing.
Um, a couple comments that tillage radishes have caused issues in the past. That's good to know. I think we had time for one more, and then we'll let Mallika plug her program that's coming up here in February. Is this maybe more towards Stephen? Can irrigating with tile cause salt accumulation in Wisconsin soils, or is that only a problem where there's already existing salt problems?
Yeah, unlikely in our system because we've got these, periods of excess precip, especially during spring that are likely to flush out anything that might accumulate.
Okay. Right, some good comments about plugging tile that's coming through. So those that want to chime in, have a little discussion there. That's great. Um, Mallika, just two last one question for you, and then we'll let you plug your program that's coming up. You talked about some getting more local data. Is that something that you're foreseeing as on-farm research, or just what farmers are already doing, and then just collecting data, so to speak, versus maybe an on-farm research type of thing?
Yeah, no, definitely on farm research. So I think it's a combination of taking advantage of the long-term trials that are in place, like the WICST, the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems trial that's in place at Arlington Research Station, where there are several years of data. And then also, those of you who are, interested in doing on-farm research on these types of topics, because it's kind of this combination with science, right? We need like all of the control in one spot, and that's why we have these amazing research stations throughout the UW system. But then we also need reality, and we need to understand limitations that all of you have with implementing these practices and different types of soils and different combinations. So that's why we need to combine that with on-farm research. So I'm envisioning a combination of those things. And then Chris has put together like a great group of folks in extension, scientists and extension folks who are interested in this issue. So I don't know, Chris, if you want to talk a little bit about that. We're kind of thinking together as a statewide team about this.
Yeah, and I think it's even beyond maybe just on-farm data for some of the things Mallika talked about. I think in general, as a whole, extension or the crops and soils program for sure I can speak to is really just promoting doing on-farm research in general, kind of on all the things. We know there's a place for continued research on the ag stations that will never go away. There's things we can do there that we can't or maybe don't want to do on farm, and there's a lot to gain by doing on farm that we don't necessarily get on station. So, but yeah, specifically to some of the soil resilience aspects that Mallika was talking about. We do have a team of people that are very interested in putting together some resources and gathering data, compiling data, going out and finding new data, talking about how do some of these conservation practices build that resilience in our system. So I guess, yeah, more to come there. Pretty exciting times on that front.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. And that brings us right up to 10:30.
Hey, can I
Yeah,
just
go ahead,
make
Francisco.
I guess a plug? So Extension hired an on-farm research coordinator, Abio Garten, and that position is relatively new. So like Chris was saying, we see this capacity where it's suitable to increase.
Okay. Yeah. All right. And Mallika, you threw in the chat, I believe, the information about that upcoming program that'll be on drainage management. So
Yeah. So we're putting together, Stephen's involved as well. Just an introduction to tile drainage workshop. I will say that because drainage has been not as much and slower here in Wisconsin compared to all of the I-state neighbors that we've got, we haven't, done as much on both research and extension in tile drainage as our neighboring states. So we're starting to ramp up in this space. So that workshop is going to be on February 20th. Kevin Erb is going to be the one that's putting it together. So I put his information in the chat. That is going to be in person in somewhere in the Fox Valleys region. We're still kind of figuring out exactly where it's going to be. Based on how this all went today, though, a part of me is wondering if there would be interest in a virtual event as well. So if you would be interested in a virtual event, like it'd be awesome if you just be like, yay, I want a virtual event in the chat box. And if enough of you say that, we will do a virtual event as well. But yeah, that's the plan. Reach out to Kevin if you want more information, and that's the date. I don't have
excellent.
a link for you to register
All
yet.
right. Nope, no problem. Nope. Good heads up. Thank you again. And so again, thank you, Mallika, Chris, Francisco, and Stephen for taking time today. Their emails are in the chat box, so we appreciate you reaching out to them if you got any more specific questions.